Disc 10.
There was, for example, the question of the bloodstain on the back gate of Nicole Brown Simpson's house. This was somehow missed in the early survey of the crime scene, and not collected until 3 weeks after the murders. Forensic scientist Dennis Fung presented a photograph of the stain, but Barry Scheck countered it with another photograph taken the day after the murder, in which no stain appeared. "Where is it, Mr. Fung?" Scheck asked, with a rhetorical flourish worthy of Perry Mason. There was no answer. The defense was able to raise sufficient doubt in the minds of the jurors about the handling and sources of the DNA samples that the DNA evidence became irrelevant. As we saw in the last chapter, sample contamination is one of the foremost banes of efforts to establish identity by genetic methods. Because it can yield a DNA fingerprint from even the tiniest sample, the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, is the modern forensic scientist's method of choice for amplifying particular segments of DNA. In the Simpson trial, for instance, crucial evidence included a single blood drop scraped from the sidewalk. But sufficient DNA for PCR can be extracted from cells in the saliva left on a cigarette butt. In fact, PCR can successfully amplify DNA from a single molecule. So if even the slightest trace of DNA from another source, someone handling the samples, for example, contaminates the evidence sample, the results are, at best, confused, and at worst, useless. In the past decade, with the broadening application and acceptance of the DNA fingerprint as a proof of identity, the law enforcement community had a flash of inspiration. Doesn't it make sense to DNA fingerprint, well, everyone? At least everyone who might be a criminal? Well, surely, the argument goes, the FBI should have a central database of DNA records. Rather, it does for conventional fingerprints. Indeed, a number of states have passed laws requiring that DNA samples be taken from anyone convicted of a violent felony, like rape or murder. For example, in 1994, North Carolina passed legislation that authorizes taking blood samples from imprisoned felons, by force if necessary. And some of those states have since extended the mandate to cover all individuals who are arrested, whether they are ultimately found guilty of a crime or not. Well, the outcry from civil libertarians has been intense, and not without reason. DNA fingerprints are not like fingerprints. A DNA sample taken for fingerprinting purposes can, in principle, be used for a lot more than merely proving identity. It can tell you a lot about me. Whether I carry mutations for disorders like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell disease, or Tay-Sachs disease. Sometime in the not-so-distant future, it may even tell you whether I carry the genetic variations predisposing me to schizophrenia or alcoholism, or traits even more likely to disturb the peace. Might the authorities, for instance, one day subject me to a more intensive scrutiny than would otherwise be the case, simply because I have a mutation in the monoamine oxidase gene that reduces the activity of the enzyme? Some research suggests that this mutation may predispose me to antisocial behavior under certain circumstances. Could genetic profiling indeed become a new tool for preemptive action in law enforcement? Philip K. Dick's 1956 story, which inspired the 2002 movie The Minority Report, may not be such far-fetched science fiction as we like to imagine. Whatever the outcome of the ongoing debate about who should be compelled to provide DNA samples and under what safeguards these ought to be maintained, the fact is that as I write, there is a huge amount of DNA fingerprinting going on. In 1990, the FBI established its DNA database, CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, and by June 2002, it contained 1,030,000 13,746 DNA fingerprints. Of these, 977,895 are from convicted offenders, and 35,851 are forensic crime scene samples of unsolved cases. Since its inception, CODIS has been used to make some 4,500 identifications that would not otherwise have been made. One major justification for a national database is the potential for making cold hits. Suppose investigators find some DNA, blood on a broken window, semen on underwear, at the crime scene, and a fingerprint is made. Now suppose they have no leads by conventional investigative means, but when the fingerprint is entered into CODIS, a match is found. That is what happened in St. Louis in 1996. The police were investigating the rapes of two young girls at opposite sides of the city, and although the two samples of semen revealed under RFLP fingerprint analysis that the same man had committed both crimes, a suspect could not be identified. 3 years later, the samples were reanalyzed using STRs, and the data compared with the entries in CODIS. In 2001, they found the rapist, Dominic Moore, whose DNA fingerprint was in CODIS because he had confessed to committing 3 other rapes in 1999. The interval between a crime and a cold hit can be even more dramatic, and some malefactors have been shocked to face the molecular j'accuse of victims long buried. In Britain, 14-year-old Marion Crofts was raped and murdered in 1981, long before DNA fingerprinting was in use. Fortunately, some physical evidence was preserved, so it was possible to make a DNA fingerprint in 1999. The authorities and Crofts' bereaved family were disappointed again, this time in learning there was no match in the United Kingdom National DNA Database. In April 2001, however, when Tony Jasinskiewicz was arrested for assaulting his wife, a DNA sample was taken from him as a matter of routine procedure. When it was entered into the database, a match came up. Jasinskiewicz was found to be the unknown rapist of 20 years before. In the United States, crimes like rape have customarily been subject to statutes of limitations in many states. In Wisconsin, for example, a warrant for the arrest of an alleged rapist cannot be issued more than 6 years after the crime has taken place. Although such statutes may seem devastatingly unfair to victims, after all, does the horror of a crime simply disappear after 6 years? They have, by tradition, served the interests of due process. Eyewitness accounts in particular are notoriously unreliable, and all memories grow hazier over time. Statutes of limitations are intended to prevent miscarriages of justice. But DNA is a witness of quite a different order. Samples stored properly remain stable for many years, and the DNA fingerprints themselves lose none of their authority to incriminate.